Hello and welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Don ARLETH. Make this your one-stop shop to take stock of all the progress on the political and literal battlefields. Now let's go ahead and get started. Volodymyr Zelensky has been serving as president of Ukraine for more than 5 years now. However, this does not mean that his term has ended, though. Martial law is still in effect, and the ongoing war forces an extension of his term.
Zelensky took office on May 20th, 2019, following a landslide victory in an election in which he earned 73% of the vote. He managed to receive clear majorities in both East and West Ukraine, overcoming the division that had plagued Ukraine since independence. His term will be most remembered for the full-scale Russian invasion, which began halfway through it. Zelensky's decision not to evacuate from Kiev and remain in the embattled city had a major impact on rallying support in the early days of the war.
Today, Russia started an invasion of Ukraine. Putin started a war against Ukraine, against the whole democratic world. We're all here. Our soldiers are here, the citizens are here, and we are here.
The biggest issue in managing the war has proved to not be internal opposition or fractional infighting, of which Ukraine saw relatively little, but securing aid from Kiev's Western backers.
I'm with you, okay?
While Ukrainian presidents are elected for a 5-year term, the martial law currently in place in Ukraine bans holding elections. The constitution does not clarify what happens when an elected politician's term ends under martial law, so Zelensky's position in office is somewhat legally unclear. Nevertheless, there is little desire for a constitutional crisis in Ukraine right now. Zelensky floated the possibility of changing the law and holding the elections before the end of the war. Opposition parties opposed this, likely wary that the rally around the leader effect would grant him an easy win.
Talk about war fatigue in the media. Well, the media will cover a plane crash that kills 100 people, but not 1,000 deadly car accidents. Similarly, Russian strikes in Ukraine, which kill 50 civilians at a time, receive broad coverage. But smaller attacks in which only 5 people are killed go virtually uncovered.
Such attacks continue along the front line, killing 1, 2, or 3 people at a time. Some of the most affected areas are the city of Kherson and the towns near the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. The areas near the heaviest fighting in the Donbass have been largely depopulated, and as a result now see less casualties. Another site of near daily death is the city of Kharkiv, where attacks have been intensified in recent weeks, as a Russian offensive is ongoing north of the city.
I was miraculously alive. Everyone around me within 5 meters died, and the doctor who came to me to put a tourniquet on my leg was hit a second time, and his arm was torn off near me. Instead of flying at me, it flew into his hand, and my hair retained all the fragments from the rocket explosion, a full glass, as a memento.
Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city, and most of its population has remained in their homes. The city is largely functioning normally, with Russian strikes interrupting daily lives in the least expected moments.
I was a busy man with my own things. I was working on my laptop when I saw a bright yellow spark. And then there was an explosion. Glass shards started to fall. Thank God the window was covered by the curtain, which held back the glass shards. Right after the explosion, I called my relatives to tell them what had happened.
During the Kharkiv counteroffensive in autumn of 2022, Ukraine pushed back Russian forces all the way to the border. However, the missile and bomb attacks are conducted from Russian territory in the neighboring Belgorod region. Ukraine is unable to effectively counter it, as Western nations have prohibited the use of weaponry they provided to Ukraine on Russian territory. As Ukraine is now largely reliant on Western weapons systems, this leaves only a handful of legacy Soviet equipment to counter the Russian attacks. President Zelensky and a group of American congressmen are pushing for a change to this policy. This change might reduce the number of people killed in Kharkiv.
In early May, Russian forces crossed the Ukrainian border and re-entered the territories lost during the autumn 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive. The attack is quickly bogged down, though, and it appears to be going nowhere and running out of steam.
On May 10th, Russian forces entered the Kharkiv region from the Belgorod area. Since autumn of 2022, the area has seen little fighting as the front ran along the border and a sort of unofficial truce took hold in the area. Russians managed to take a few villages near the border, but were stopped after advancing about 5 kilometers. Heavy clashes are ongoing in the area, with fighting focusing on the towns of Vovchansk and Lipsky.
It's 24/7. Their infantry keeps coming. We keep fighting their attacks. At least we are trying to. Whenever possible, we put them down. We were positioned in the Bakhmut area before. Now we've been transferred here. It's much hotter here. There, it was less intense as compared to what's going on here.
Ukrainian intelligence warned in early spring that Russians are preparing new formations to attack in new areas. The old front line is heavily fortified by now, while the border areas further north are largely unprepared and lightly staffed. Ukraine has thrown in reserves into Kharkiv regions, hoping stopping the Russian advance there will dissuade similar advances elsewhere.
We will be getting ammunition because we're up against a numerous and serious enemy group. If we can demonstrate now that we're able, in such an extreme situation, to stop the enemy's big-scale assault on Kharkiv and the Kharkiv region, the enemy will not dare to think of attacking the Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy or Poltava regions.
Ukraine usually has the advantage of being able to strike Russian rear areas with HIMARS missiles. This key ability is lacking in the northern Kharkiv region, as Russian rear areas are located on Russian territory, where Ukraine is prohibited from using most Western-supplied weapon systems.
Russia is using a so-called shadow fleet of tankers in order to skirt sanctions on its oil sales. Now, Western countries are aiming to tighten these sanctions.
The roughly dozen tankers of the so-called shadow fleet are old and often lack insurance, which increases the chances of an oil spill.
What is happening right now because of the sanctions against Russia could become both a security and an environmental tragedy. There is a lot that can happen in the form of a hybrid operation and the like, and there is a whole game plan to play on.
Their activities have also attracted attention, with some worry they could be used for hybrid operations.
We find antennas and masts that normally do not belong to a fishing vessel, for example. So it's clear that we feel that there are sometimes other objectives for their activities when they are at sea.
In order to restrict the actions of the shadow fleet, the EU and the US are preparing additional sanctions. The EU plans to bar them from entering European ports and from using the services of European companies. The US plans to freeze the assets of Sovcomflot, the company operating the vessels. These actions would complicate Russia selling oil at above the $60 per barrel limit established by the previous sanctions. Russian oil was not banned entirely for the fear of spiking the energy prices and damaging the economy. Nevertheless, enforcing the price cap limits Russian oil revenues.
And now it's that part of the show where we take a look at the front lines in the east, of course, going from southern Ukraine all the way up to the Kharkiv region. Now, we're going to spend just a little bit of time here and talk about the Kharkiv region, near Vovchansk, of course, and Lukyantsy. Those are the two areas where Russian forces have broken through the border and are trying to make the Ukrainian forces redeploy to those areas, most likely in an attempt to continue to put pressure on areas further down the line in the Luhansk and the Donetsk oblasts. Now, as you can see here on this map, Stary Saltiv, that is one location we're going to talk about in just a minute. That is where residents of Vovchansk, that is the point where they've had to cross through to evacuate that city as Russian forces continue to try and take it. As reported right now that Russian forces are near the center of the city and heavy gun battles are going on there. However, we did mention earlier that the city of Vovchansk is still holding, and of course the Russian advance is losing a bit of steam, so we'll keep our eye on the Kharkiv region and of course city of Vovchansk and the area to the north there as this week continues, and we'll report on the developments next week. Well, let's leave you now with a few images from Ukraine's war and, of course, Russian attacks on civilians. And now it's that time to look at the war in Ukraine through a journalist lens. And for that, I'm joined by Dmytro Kovalchuk, local producer and volunteer from Kyiv. Hello, Dima. Thanks for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Dobry wieczór, Don. Thanks for having me there.
Absolutely. Now, we've talked earlier. Why don't you tell us and our viewers about the situation you saw when you visited Stary Saltiv and you saw the people getting evacuated there out of Vovchansk?
So I got there on the first day of the big push by Russians on Vovchansk. I went to evacuation point where people were brought from Vovchansk and suburban villages nearby. We saw lots of people were just with their one bag, two bags from Volchansk, but from nearby villages they got some time to prepare, so they took some more luggage of their stuff and also some animals, cats and dogs. The situation there is. Yes, the situation there is bad, and I talked with civilians, with local residents of Vovchansk at the evacuation point. I asked them why they decide to evacuate now on the first day of this big push, and why they didn't evacuate, on the first day or on the second day. They were saying that they were hoping that it will be just pass over. It will be shelled for 1-2 days and then it will stop. But as you see, it's not stopping, and so they took everything what they could carry, and and left Vovchansk and suburban villages. So mostly people are evacuated by national police, emergency service, by some volunteers. Some of them who have cars, they evacuate by their own cars. But the situation in situations there is really dangerous.
Right, certainly. So it sounds like everybody thought that it was just going to be temporary, but the fighting got pretty intense, and so most people have pretty much left the city by now. Well, Dmytro Kovalchuk, Dima, thank you very much for sharing that with us. We need to move on now, so thank you, and I hope to have you on some other time here on Ukraine This Week. Take care.
Thank you.
Ukraine is suffering from a shortage of air defense systems and ammunition to protect the skies. Kiev's Western backers are now struggling to quickly provide it with more of this crucial equipment. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin is reportedly ready to propose a ceasefire along the entire front line.
The Ukrainian vulnerability in the area of air defense was exploited this year by Russian forces. Missile strikes targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure, causing more damage than during the winter of 2022-2023.
This morning, we saw another example of a targeted attack on energy infrastructure. We went to a coal-fired power plant. This is one of the 7 that have been targeted in the recent days. 25% of Ukrainians' energy supply has been destroyed. A few months ago, I saw another example of such targeted destruction, namely the water supply in Mykolaiv. This is a strategy. It is not an accident.
Russian aviation has also intensified its operations on the front lines, utilizing glide bombs. These can be launched from further away, requiring longer-range air defense systems to strike aircraft deploying them. This puts Kiev in a difficult position, forcing the nation to focus air defense assets either in big cities, protecting infrastructure and civilians, or on the front lines, protecting the soldiers. The Russian capture of Avdiivka was greatly aided by the use of glide bombs. NATO allies are now rushing to fill Ukraine's air defense capability gap. Longer-range systems are where most pressing need is. German Iris-T, Norwegian NASAMS, and American-produced Patriots are best suited for these roles.
We launched our initiative because we, of course, realized that there is not enough support when it comes to air defense for Ukraine. Germany provided 25% of our Patriot capacities to Ukraine, more than any other country in the world. Therefore, we started that initiative to make possible and to ask other countries to do more on themselves.
Military aid to Ukraine slowed down after NATO countries handed over most of their surplus or old equipment. They are much less eager to part with modern systems forming key parts of their defense strategy, especially given their efforts to rearm and increase military capacity.
It is very complicated, not to mention the fact that I do not accept under any circumstances that Romania remains without anti-missile defense and without anti-aircraft defense. This is what we're talking about. So to the extent that something is given in the end, Romania must receive something else. Otherwise, nothing will be done.
Another asset that could be used for air defense are fighter jets. The first batch of Ukrainian pilots finished their training on F-16 fighter jets this week, bringing the employment of this crucial capability by Ukraine closer.
For weeks here on TVP World, I and my colleagues have been pressing the Polish government, or asking many top experts, whether it is prudent to shoot down Russian missiles from Polish airspace over Ukrainian territory. A little update for you. Polish Foreign Minister spokesperson Paweł Wronski stated on May 23rd that Poland is considering using its air defense forces to protect Ukrainian airspace against Russian airstrikes, something we applaud here on Ukraine This Week and on TVP World. And now for some valuable insight, Poland's former top general sounds off on whether Poland and NATO should shoot down missiles over Ukraine, among other hot topics. And now joining me here on Ukraine This Week is retired General Rajmund Andrzejczak, the former chief of the General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Big pleasure.
Now, we've seen the recent delay in assistance package for Ukraine. We've seen the problems that's caused on the front lines. We've also seen more than 2 years at war since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In your opinion, what does Ukraine need to win this war? And what does victory look like?
Well, I just been a couple of weeks ago in Kiev, and I remember my first visit when I was talking to the former Chief of Defense, John Zaluzhny, and there was a long soldier-to-soldier discussion about the definition of victory and how to do it. So he gave me some kind of a definition that we can describe as the victory will be if the Russia is not ready to be back again. And he told me, you know, they will be back again. Historically, we know it very well. So it means that the building geometry, Russia is not able to invade Ukraine again. We need a victory. We need territory back to Ukrainian. We need the guarantee. Otherwise, Ukraine will still pay 50% of GDP for defense, but not 2 or 3. So it sounds very much simple. And that was his description he gave me, and I asked him for permission to use it publicly in Poland. So time is running, and I'm back again in Ukraine talking to Ukrainians, very much frustrated and not so optimistic. And they say, why are you asking me about definition of victory? Because once we presenting how we see, you say no way. So that's the big problem, because it's very simple. From a military perspective, how to win a war. You have to be successfully, operationally, strategically, tactically. So the long-range fires capability we deliver to Ukraine are already in the possession of Ukrainian armed forces, but there is no permission to use it. And the way it will be effective and mean deep strikes into territory of Russia. And that's the biggest problem. There's more problem should be solved by us, not necessarily by Ukrainians. It's the same, aviation, F-16s, HIMARSs, and entire list of combat systems. So it looks like we have too much hesitations, and we're supporting Ukraine enough to fight, but not to win, which is a huge difference.
Still a big lack of political will?
Absolutely, absolutely. So about the performance of Ukrainian armed forces, about the structure, decision-making process, the planning, they're okay. I don't see any challenges, but effectiveness, engagement, the system delivering capabilities to the Russian army to the front. I mean, deep fires, destroying the infrastructure, critical infrastructure of production, with the coordination of sanctions will be the most effective system, not separately, sanctions, but no everywhere, and then not allowing Ukrainians to engage targets when they should engage.
In terms of hardware or capabilities, is there something that the West can do, the West can provide, that would be a game changer?
Strategically, if you look in the history, there never be example that one single Wunderwaffen won a war. In the Second World War, everybody knows legends about the German Tiger tanks or V1 systems, or in the history telegraph or railway and so on. And the end of the day is still economy. It's money, it's human potential, and of course strategy. So I would shift a little bit discussion from sensors and effectors and certain combat systems as a game changer. I would move to the strategy, political will, leadership, good decision in the proper time, but not good decision but too late.
President Zelensky said that the West is very much afraid of a Ukrainian victory and a Russian defeat. Why do you think the West is so afraid of a Russian defeat?
So you ask me as a Polish. So from a Polish perspective, we have a completely different. So we are not afraid. This is our strategical objective. Russia losing is our strategical objective. And Poland is a great example. How should we behave? I mean, from the very first day, we delivered, combat system, tanks, APCs, artillery, also the helicopters, airplanes, and so on. We received 8 million Ukrainians with no limitations. So Poland, and then plus our investments in the industry, 40% GDP, 300,000 army. So it's difficult to say. Probably this message was not to Poland, but some other countries.
Right. But if you've dealt with the Americans a lot. It seems like the Americans are still undecided politically whether they truly want. I've been saying this for a long time. Yeah, I'm sure you've observed it too.
Polish perspective is very much focused on the main threat, which is Russia. This is the Polish eastern flank and as well the NATO perspective, because Russia is direct threat, and we see what they're doing every day in Ukraine, and not only Ukraine. Mm-hmm. From U.S. perspective, they have very much complex, geometry. They see the China, they see the Taiwan, they see the Israel and Gaza, and everything is some kind of a concern of how to invest still the same resources to the certain geographical areas and in a proper timeline. So that's the friction of interest, and we should not criticize each other, but rather sit down to the table and to ask ourselves how to understand, how to help each other to solve the three big problems at the same time.
President Zelensky has also said that NATO should use its anti-air systems to defeat Russian missiles over the territory of Ukraine. We saw this incident just a few weeks back of, just briefly, a Russian missile crossing Polish airspace. The decision was made not to shoot it down. Should Poland, looking at threats originating out of Ukraine, potential threats, should Poland shoot down those missiles?
We have two dimensions. One is very much military and technical. So technically and militarily, it doesn't really matter when you see the target on your radar and you engage a target. For missile, crossing boundary is absolutely far away from consideration. But politically, it matters. It's completely different once we engaged from a territory of NATO, another target in a territory of non-NATO state. So this is a question to mitigate the risks, because Poland is taking much more strategical risks right now today, being in the front line, comparing to other countries. So again, we are inspiration for other countries how to approach to the security, but we also asking about understanding of balancing the risks we're taking, and so from a military perspective, it wouldn't be complicated, but from political perspective, all of the implications is extremely difficult. But I'll give you some inspiration. We have a more than 2 years war, and in the very beginning, sending tanks to Ukraine was absolutely far away from imagination. It was escalatory factor. If we're sending tanks, Russia immediately pushed the button, and the Iskanders are flying and engaging targets in the territory of NATO. We sent, nothing happened. The same was with the HIMARSes. There was a secret weapon, too difficult, too advanced, and too escalatory. HIMARSes are, working in Ukraine. Patriots and the F-16s. If you look back in the relatively strategically short perspective, which is 2 years, F-16s in the beginning was unthinkable. So maybe think unthinkable should be a good policy for at least intellectual exercise, and then finally, political decisions.
And ultimately, it is a political decision. Well, General Rajmund Andrzejczak, thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine this week. And of course, you can't follow the war in Ukraine without insight from the Institute for the Study of War. On Ukraine this week, we talked to the team lead on Russia. Have a look. And now I'd like to welcome here on TVP World George Barros, the Russia team lead at the Institute of Study of War. We're here at the Polish Institute of International Affairs Strategic Arc Conference. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Don.
Now, I think for our viewers, a good starting point would be for you to describe exactly what it is you do and how you do it there at the Institute for the Study of War.
Absolutely. So at the Institute, we are a nonprofit, open source intelligence, foreign policy and national security research organization. Our mission is to help inform policymakers by helping provide a better understanding for critical military operations and threats that concern the United States and U.S. allies. In terms of how we actually do what we do open source intelligence. That is, we take the tradecraft and methodology from the U.S. intelligence community with slight modifications, and instead of using that structured analytical technique on classified data, secret sources, we just apply it to open sources. So that is information that we can find online or data that we can purchase from commercial providers. But no secret information, no classified information, and the end result is a pretty high fidelity intelligence product that policymakers find useful.
Right now, that geospatial intelligence that you buy from private providers, tell me, is that up to date, day by day? Like, can you access real-time pictures of the situation on the battlefield there in Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work with a number of space technology partners who collect a variety of different sort of data sources. It's probably, I think, maybe 3 or 4 types of data that we find very informative that we use, that we collect. Either we pay for it or we work with tech partners. But planets like Maxar and companies like Planet Labs and Maxar, they collect electro-optical imagery, sort of like spaceborne photography. Planet Labs images the Earth every single day. So barring no cloud cover, you're able to see the battlefield in medium resolution. For those instances where you do have cloud cover, we have other types of technology that we can use to collect on the battlefield. Radar, for example, cuts through the cloud. So companies like ISI, they sell a product called synthetic aperture radar. We also collect thermal and heat data. NASA has a really awesome sensor that collects data for heat anomalies, for forest fires, and it was originally designed for conservation purposes, but war is a exothermic undertaking. A lot of fires are created in war, and we found that when we find these anomalous heat signatures on the battlefield in Ukraine, very often it corresponds with where we see reports of attacks, and we can use those signatures to be able to verify what's happening. Another source of commercial data that we use is actually precision device location. So when you download an app from the Apple Store or I guess the Google Play Store and you give it permissions for certain things, those companies vacuum up location data for users, and they do oftentimes resell it. And so we can purchase user tracker location data for Russian mobile devices because it's just out there and it's commercially available.
And so is that a good indicator of where Russians are gathering?
It is a useful indicator. Mm-hmm. It's dependent on a couple different factors. The Russians, they've tightened down on their operational security. They've tried to enact rules that prohibit and ban Russian troops from being able to carry their personal devices in the combat zones, but nonetheless, their discipline isn't 100% perfect, though improved, and you can still get some really good indicators. One thing, for example, that I found really helpful with this technology is actually tracking the Russian military footprint in Belarus. We saw this really incredible influx of these mobile device signatures on major Belarusian training grounds back in late 2022, mid-2023, when the Russians were actually sending a whole bunch of their forces to Belarus when Russian President Vladimir Putin called the partial mobilization. We could see the trainees going to the training grounds there and then leave, and then eventually their devices turned up in frontline locations and border crossings with Russia near Ukraine. So that was a very helpful indicator.
Now, in terms of sharing intelligence with Ukraine, is that a part of your operations, or?
We are not a combat support team. We don't share any information with, the Ukrainians in terms of helping them with their actual planning and operations. They have classified information for that. We don't have any access to classified information, but we do share our reports, and we do share our data with U.S. and allied governments. I do a lot of briefings with senior policymakers in Washington. We support NATO. We've provided reports that we hope help the Ukrainians. But really, our primary target audience are the civilian decision makers, and helping them undertake the correct strategic decisions to help enable the correct policies to help us ensure that we stop the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I spent about a year in Ukraine as a correspondent since the full-scale invasion, and one of the most difficult parts of my job was to get clear and factual information about the current situations along the front lines. For the most part, we turned to the Institute for the Study of War. Are you faced with a dilemma sometimes about releasing certain bits of information, or does your mission dictate otherwise, that it's important to release the information and make it public knowledge?
Yeah, we strongly believe that if a certain piece of information can have utility for the policymaker, provide some more clarity, help them make the right decision at the right time, we're usually going to release it. But we always caveat it. Generally speaking, we only put out information that we think is medium to high confidence. But sometimes, on rare occasion, we will put out a report that's a low confidence assessment. And we'll usually explicitly caveat it as such, and we'll say, the Institute has made a decision to publish this particular forecast or this particular potential warning forecast based on the fact that it's not a very likely event, but it would be like a low probability, high impact event, and that policymakers should at least be forecasting and be aware of the potentiality of this sort of risk. So we have done that sort of reporting before. I'll also note that we've had to take some precautionary steps in how we do our reporting. We've gotten a lot of really good details about Russian operations, not from the Ukrainian side, but from the Russians and their own sourcing. Telegram is a really wonderful source, and there's a lot of rich information that can be extracted from it if you know how and where to look. But unfortunately, what the Russians have been doing really since late 2022 is they are either arresting, assassinating, or trying to get Russian military bloggers to engage in self-censorship, to be less candid about the problems of the Russian military and their successes and sometimes. And what we've had to do is, instead of listing all of our sources, which we do in the endnotes of all of our reports, is sometimes we'll redact it and we'll say, this is collected from, we'll sanitize it, we'll say collected from a Russian military source. The reference will be available to responsible parties, because we don't want the Kremlin ultimately to use our reports as sort of a hit list of saying, all right, these are the sources that we need to shut up.
Right, certainly. Now, we've been witnessing this latest Russian offensive on the Kharkiv region. Since I have you here today, I have to ask, based on what you're seeing, are you still of the opinion that Russia is trying to create a buffer zone there along the border, or are they trying to make an earnest attempt at perhaps encroaching on the city of Kharkiv itself?
Yeah, I have no doubt in my mind that Russian President Vladimir Putin has somewhere a major operational objective to seize Kharkiv city. I don't think that the current operation that he began on May 10, however, is that operation. I think it can help set the conditions for a subsequent campaign for the seizure of Kharkiv city, but studying like the specific tactical details of this campaign, the contours of it shape up to show that I think that the objectives are something different, and allow me to elaborate on that. If the Russians were interested in actually seizing Kharkiv city, I think they would have needed a larger force grouping. The force grouping estimate size is like 30 to 50,000 Russian troops in the area in Belgorod, and we know that it's about 3 divisions. If you're being generous, that's completely insufficient to be able to complete the seizure of Kharkiv. When the Russians initiated their penetration on May 10, they notably only tried to penetrate due north of Kharkiv and then the northwest near Vovchansk. They did not, or pardon me, northeast. They did not attack the northwest. And if we were expecting to see a large envelopment or an effort to encircle, we would have also expected a breach coming from the western flank as well. Also, crucially, Vovchansk is around a bunch of wetlands and water features, and the Russians have destroyed the bridges and some dams over the major reservoir in the area. Now, if the Russians wanted to seize Vovchansk and then use that as a stepping stone from which to then drive towards Kharkiv, they would in theory need those bridges and dams, and they wouldn't have destroyed them as part of the initial attack. They would want to leverage them to keep moving. So the destruction of those dams suggests that what they're trying to do is suck Ukrainian forces into difficult terrain that's hard to infiltrate and exfiltrate in and out of, engage them there, fix them and pin them to prevent those Ukrainian forces from being used elsewhere. bottom line up front, it seems that the Kharkiv operation, it's not the Russian command's main offensive effort for 2024. It is more likely than not a supporting effort for where the Russian main operational focus will be for this campaign season this summer, which we can assess is eastern Ukraine, Donetsk Oblast, and in particular, the Chasiv Yar area.
Predictions for Chasiv Yar?
Yeah, I really hope that the Ukrainians manage to blunt the Russian offensive and not lose that town. It's a operationally significant town because it's only about 6 kilometers away from we call it sort of the fortress belt of major Ukrainian operationally significant cities, starting from Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Tuchkivka, Konstantinivka in the south. It's only about 6 kilometers. You have to go further west once you're in Chasiv Yar to get between and work your way between the seam between Konstantinivka and Drushkivka. And if the Russians manage to wiggle their way in there, they could try to pry apart Konstantinivka from the rest of that interlinked chain of large prepared Ukrainian defensive points and try to slowly and systematically dismantle it. That would be very bad. So Chasiv Yar in and of itself, not the end of the world if the Ukrainians do have to withdraw from it, but the follow-on campaign for the fortress city, I mean, that would be quite significant. It's to be determined whether or not the Ukrainians will lose Chasiv Yar or not, and we'll see. I'll say that the Ukrainians do have some tactical advantages in defending the city. It is on a tactical high ground. There's some canalizing terrain features in the way that force the Russians to go into column formation. The city is bisected by a large canal, which the Russians have had some difficulty in trying to cross. They've crossed it in some limited places, but it's still difficult terrain that favors the defender. And I think the key factor will be, can the Ukrainians hold it out long enough until the American aid that's being surged reaches the front lines at scale to really stabilize it, or will the Russians be able to eke out those tactical gains?
Right. One final question, because I know a lot of people are wondering when the military aid that's been promised for Ukraine will arrive on the battlefields, and we're also anticipating this Russian offensive before that happens, which I think we're seeing and is underway. But when do we expect that equipment to get there in earnest in order to hold the line and stop any Russian advancement?
It's going to take several weeks for the equipment to reach the front lines at scale. There's been some sectors of the front where some equipment has arrived, some of the pre-positioned stuff that was ready to go as soon as the supplemental was adopted. But for the equipment to reach at scale, that's going to take several weeks. And so really what we're looking at now is the pivotal moment where the Russians, they see the window of opportunity. They have indeed launched their offensive effort, quite possibly prematurely, because they understand that this window of opportunity before the aid arrives is shrinking. And now the Ukrainians are sort of caught, not surprised, but knowing that they now have to fend off several major offensive Russian efforts while still largely under-equipped with units that are not manned to their desired end strength and waiting for the aid to arrive. I think if the Ukrainians can last out the next 4 to 6 weeks, the things will stabilize, and the Ukrainians should be able to deny any Russian advances, as the Ukrainians denied major Russian advances really over the last 9 months when they had sufficient ammunition.
Right, certainly. Well, George Burroughs, Russia team lead for the Institute of the Study of War, thank you very much for joining us today here on TVP World. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Don. It's a pleasure.
And that's all the time we have on the program. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.